There was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and well, there was this brief period when in Belarus the parliament was a major force. But of course, there had to be the presidential elections. And in that time, there were there were three major candidates. There was Shushkevich, who basically represented the Soviet nomenclature, more or less. So he was kind of an old-time Soviet bureaucrat. And there was, Pozniak, who was, an anti-Soviet, anti-Russian intellectual who was kind of very conservative in his social views, but very pro-liberal economically and pro-Western. And there was Lukashenko, who was basically a populist. Platform was dealing with corruption, and since it was pretty clear that people were not really happy with Shushkevich, who was seen as very much Soviet style, and people weren't happy with Pozniak, who mostly represented the intelligentsia, and who also basically wanted shock reforms. So Lukashenko said, okay, people, we're going to deal with corruption first, and then I promise you there will be no shock reforms. Mind you, he didn't promise like building communism or anything. He was actually promising more of a kind of a social welfare state, and slowly and gradually moving to capitalism. Long story short, he won. Many populists actually become authoritarian, probably. Like, it's common enough. He was very much a man of the people, you know, like regular Joe. That's why people liked him mostly. So you could say that he won that election fairly. And when we hear about the 26 years of dictatorship in Belarus, it's not exactly true, yeah? Like, the first years were not dictatorship. It was he was elected in a democratic election. There was a large metropolitan workers' strike. So the metro workers had a strike, and the strike was crushed. Then as for the parliamentary opposition, they were basically beaten, and the parliamentary opposition was crushed by police force, and mostly police force. And there were some reforms that actually gave the president more power. So this is more or less when Lukashenko is starting to become authoritarian. There were repressions. People mostly supported him. He was true to his word. He managed to preserve the industry. He managed to preserve a lot of public institutions and mostly free healthcare. So people didn't want drastic change. More than 40% of the workers that are actually employed by public enterprises. Well, it's supposedly public, but the thing is that a lot of the money goes into the pockets of bureaucrats, do not reach the actual public. I come from a small town myself. Basically, the mayor has been from the same family for many years. And most of the enterprises in our district were owned by members of the same family, so it's like that in many places. Lukashenko have been conducting the liberal reforms for many years. He's been slowly privatizing the factories. They actually even supported the introduction of a contract system that made while the life of work is even more precarious. Yeah. So Lukashenko actually, well, effectively, he crushed the independent labor unions. And these days, labor unions don't do much in Belarus. In the early 90s, the labor unions actually became active again, and they actually were like a major power, you could say. And kind of the workers in the early 90s, when they wanted to protest, they organized with the labor unions. But while Lukashenko basically crushed the opposition in labor unions, and they became very obedient, and they only collected their money, and what they could do is they gave you a small present, like on your birthday, like a chocolate, or maybe a bigger present. You like turned 50. The independent labor unions are almost non-existent in Belarus these days. They do exist, but they what they can offer is, well, a bit of a help in court, perhaps, if you want to sue your employer. Well, that's something, but there are very few people, and they're very limited by legislation and by the pressure from the government. I also taught a bit in in a public school, and then afterwards at a university, which was actually, and the main reason I don't work at university or public school anymore is that there's no there's no independent labor union for teachers. Well, I actually tried to organize some of the teachers at my public school, and it didn't go well. No one really threatened to kill me, but the thing is that I just started not to get my bonuses like every month. Then there were a lot of conflicts with administration. As for the current protests, I've only been trying to kind of work with the workers to explain a bit where their interests lie. These days there's also kind of a new group of activists whose aim is basically to try and steer the striking workers a little bit to the to the left. The leftist ideas were hardly popular at all. It was mostly all liberalism. People were getting more and more unhappy about the economic situation, because the president's favorite promise was that, okay, we'll by a year this and that, we'll reach an average salary of $500. It was becoming a running joke, because we never quite reached that $500. There was the crisis. Belarusian ruble collapsed. People could buy less again. The prices were less regulated again. And then there was the coronavirus. And you're probably familiar with Lukashenko's reaction. Yeah, is that if the best cure for any virus is just hop in your tractor and drink a couple of shots of vodka, and it's going to be fine. People here are mostly used to these kinds of absurd statements from Lukashenko, considering that our healthcare system is actually still holding up pretty well. People were unhappy, and they were also unhappy about the fact that the authorities never seem to be able to actually react properly and to say that, okay, we are going to do this and that. And then there was this, a relatively minor but Tallinn crisis with water in Minsk, I think 1/3 of Minsk became undrinkable, and for a couple of days the authorities were denying it, and people got into hospitals because of that. So it was relatively minor, but it also worked to undermine the confidence many people had in our authorities. So when the elections came, you have to keep it in mind that there was almost no presidential campaign by Lukasenka. It was a very lazy campaign. And a lot of people who didn't vote for Lukasenka and voted for some other candidate, they actually didn't vote for that candidate. They voted against Lukasenka. We just have no way of knowing for sure who has how many votes. Well, she definitely got more votes than it's stated in the official results. She wasn't even the candidate originally, right? So originally, probably the most popular opposition candidate was Babarika, but which is a little bit surprising because people tend not to be particularly fond of bankers. He was put into jail because, you know, it was on charges of corruption mostly, and of course, and money laundering. It was definitely not 80%. There are basically two ways this could develop. So if the protests collapse, or at least they go into, you know, like some kind of long-term phase, like slowly going on and never leading to anything, then these workers will basically be seen by our authorities as kind of aligned with the opposition only. They will not be seen as the independent force that has to be reckoned with. And more or less the same could happen if the opposition takes over. We do remember that opposition is mostly liberal or right-wing liberal, and they're all about the invisible hand of the market that is kind of going to take away the workers' jobs, but then it's going to you know, miraculously move them into the comfortable chair of an IT company, which is not going to happen, of course. This is why the leftists are actually trying to talk with the workers and convince them that they should put forward some demands of their own, like about ending the contract system and enabling independent labor unions again. The regular leaflets, social media groups, and messenger groups where discussions are going on. And then there's well, the regular way of actually, you know, going to the workers and talking to them, which is not that hard these days because well, the workers frequently join the demonstrations. If you try and come into the factory, in some cases you might just be not let in, you know. In other cases, the workers might be naturally suspicious, but when it's during the demonstrations with a lot of people around, well, it's kind of more fruitful, so to say. In the media, you can see that there are mass strikes. It's not quite like that. So far, there's only one factor that's actually striking. And the other factors are protesting. Mostly at lunchtime and after work. It is probably scary for our authorities that this is the first time the workers have become politically involved, like in a long while. I am a bit skeptical as to the idea that, you know, a coalition council is going to take over. But even if they do, it's essential that the workers do not just go back to factories. It's essential that they put in forward their demands. It's essential that they do not let liberal politicians privatize everything. I'm really hoping that the workers acquire these skills and the new consciousness that they start seeing themselves as the actual force. The liberal opposition doesn't do it right now much because they can easily see that a lot of the protesters were not exactly their regular fan base, and they don't want to scare off the protesters. So that's why, for example, Tikhanovskaya probably never even spoke about her economic program at all. The 90s and the shock reforms are definitely not something most people are eager to see. Well, we've seen what happened in many other countries, and just like when Lukashenko came to power, the Belarusian people do not want any drastic change like with shock reforms.